Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for our final event of the term, Theories of Consciousness and Psychedelics, a talk by the brilliant neuroscientist Pedro Mediano. I've had the fortune of collaborating with Pedro in my own PhD research. He's an amazing neuroscientist who's written papers analyzing brain data on psychedelics, as well as theoretical papers about consciousness and emergence. I'll just introduce Pedro briefly before we get onto the talk, which will be about 45 minutes. Then we'll have time for some questions, and then we'll go to the pub, to the usual place, the King's Arms, afterwards. So, long ago, when the temperature of the universe was around 10 to the 8 Kelvin, Pedro did a physics degree at the University of Valencia, Spain, truncating what could have otherwise been a promising career as a jazz melodica player. When he decided the neutrinos were interesting, but not quite for him, he did a PhD at Imperial College, London, and a postdoc at the University of Cambridge, where he, rather unsuccessfully, in all fairness, tried to solve the mysteries of consciousness and complexity. At the moment, he continues to fail to solve consciousness, although you should cut yourself some slack, Pedro, and artificial intelligence as a lecturer at the Department of Computing at Imperial College London. Broadly speaking, his research lies at the intersection between consciousness science, information theory, complexity science, and machine learning. He strives to ground his research in solid mathematical and theoretical grounds, and whenever possible, he publishes open source software to make his research accessible and reproducible. He also has a few online talks for both technical and general audiences that you can find on his website, pmediano.gitlab.io. He often teams up with his fantastic friends and collaborators, Fernando Rosas and Andrea Lupi. They do awesome stuff, and you should check out their papers too. So without further ado, Pedro, please.
All right, amazing. All right, thanks a lot, Kenneth, for the introduction. Can everyone hear me at the back before we start? Yeah, is Zoom running? Nice, amazing. Those of you online, let us know if there's any issues. Cool, amazing. Well, thank you all for coming. Like, it's super amazing. I'm really glad to be here. Thanks a lot to Kenneth and Sam and everyone from the Oxford Psychedelic Society. I've been really excited about this for a long time. Hi, everyone. My name is Pedro Mediano, and I have a really amazing job, actually. So I am a lecturer in computer science at Imperial College. So I am in a computer science department. Until very recently, I was in a corner office. The people to my right did work on compilers. The people to my left did work on first-order logic. And somehow they let me sit around and think about consciousness, which is fantastic. Like, it's a really tremendous bunch. So today I'm going to be talking about, a few theories of consciousness. What are they? What does it even mean to kind of do research on consciousness? And what can we learn about consciousness with psychedelics? And how can we kind of probe the boundaries of our understanding of consciousness through the scientific use of psychedelic substances? Now, as a bit of a disclaimer, I was a bit unsure as to how to pitch this talk precisely, right? Because I know that some people in the audience are real experts in consciousness, some people, may not. So I've basically tried to make it such that everyone is just a little bit disappointed. And that's, why it's a good compromise. So some people might find some things very obvious. Other people might find some things completely unintelligible. And if both of those things happen, then I will know I have succeeded. So without further ado, before I start, I would like to introduce, first of all, actually kind of tell you about the amazing people that I work with, the people that did the work. So mostly my collaborators, Fernando and Andrea, like Kenneth mentioned, brilliant students, Teresa and Hardik, and then a few brilliant supervisors, Anil, Robin, Adam, and Dan, that, taught me how to write about my ideas so that people would care about them. And as another quick disclaimer, this is a bit how the talk is going to go. So I'm going to start with this kind of grandiose spiel about consciousness, and then I'll probably have to rush very quickly towards the end if we run out of time. So I hope you'll forgive me should that happen. All right, then. Consciousness. So I am a somewhat self-described consciousness scientist. So I like thinking about consciousness. What is it that, the mush of, wet and noisy neurons we have between our ears somehow generates this? And, primarily, so consciousness was, it has been studied for quite some time, but until fairly recently was not a matter of a scientific study. It was more of a, humanities sort of thing. It was only recently that scientists have actually tried to get their hands into the problem of consciousness. And as a scientist, what do? Well, we sort of poke things with a stick. And that's really the essence of science, right? You see something in the world, you're fascinated by it. I am fascinated by consciousness. I hope some of you are too. So we poke it with a stick and see what happens, right? So how does that look like specifically? One fantastic way, or kind of the way that I kind of like to think about psychedelics, is as incredible sticks to poke consciousness and to poke the mind, right? So back when I was kind of preparing this talk, I went out and I kind of went to look at the kind of popular definition of psychedelics. I mean, there are chemical definitions of whatnot, but sort of what do normal dictionaries say about psychedelics? Well, the word psychedelic, as you may know, is a sort of combination of two words from Greek: psyche, meaning mind or soul, and delos, meaning, manifest, to reveal. So the substances that reveal the mind, right? I'm guessing some of you may have heard of this. Accordingly, the first definition you get in something like the Wiktionary is any psychoactive substance such as LSD or psilocybin, that blah blah. Usual definition so far, that much I expected. But there was a second definition that had me very amused. So hip is slang, awesome, cool, and groovy. And I couldn't resist to put that in the presentation. So why do we care about psychedelics? Why are they so interesting for the perspective of consciousness science? So this is kind of the overall line of thinking that kind of has me perplexed for quite some time now. So let's say you have a brain. I'm hoping you do too. So you have a brain, and your brain does lots of stuff. Again, it's a big bunch of neurons, about 10 billion of them, and they do things and they talk to each other in very particular ways. And let's say that you go and you travel and you stumble across an incredible sight of outstanding beauty, right? And that is really amazing. And sort of one of the first question that we ask or the kind of most fundamental question that we ask in consciousness science is, why on earth can this mush of 10 billion neurons actually generate the feeling of awe, the feeling of beauty, the experience of being situated somewhere in the world, and allowing you to kind of admire that scene? So that is, to me, a truly fascinating fundamental question. But not only that, but then if now your brain is kind of, you put in your brain a few micrograms of a completely alien substance it has never before seen in its evolutionary history, then suddenly everything changes. And then the nature of your experience changes radically, right? And you start making connections, seeing colors, seeing things that are only in your mind, but seemingly not in the outside world, maybe. How does this happen, right? So the kind of key questions for consciousness science is, well, given this kind of very, very complicated, network or thing that's made of 10 billion other things that are the neurons, first of all, why does it feel like something to be 10 billion neurons? Because that is what we are. That's what each one of us is. And not only that, but why do tiny perturbations change this feel like somethingness in such incredible and radical ways? Right? Those are kind of, to me, absolutely perplexing questions. And I would love to have an answer. I would love to tell you I'm going to give you an answer today. I won't, because I still continue to fail to solve consciousness. But kind of this is what really drives me in my kind of thinking time whenever I get a bit of it. So one thing you might try to do when you're actually starting to think about consciousness is trying to define consciousness, right? And it's actually really hard, it turns out. So people in consciousness science and as a field of research fight quite a lot, right? So some people say that consciousness is all about emotions, or it's thinking about thinking, or it doesn't even exist, or it's all about free will. And in here, I'm sort of showing these two groups of people yelling at each other, but in reality, it's actually everyone yelling at everyone else. So in that sense, it's truly magical what consciousness research actually looks like. So no one can really agree on any given definition. There's a few definitions that really stand out. And one that I actually quite like because of its simplicity, it's this kind of very, very simple definition by philosopher Erich Schwitt-Gabel that in 2016 wrote, consciousness is the most folk psychologically obvious thing or feature that the positive examples possess, those positive examples being sensory experiences, vivid emotions, and dreams, and that the negative examples, such as growth hormone release and dispositional knowledge and sensory reactivity to masked visual displays, lack. right? And that's basically a very convoluted way of saying, well, we don't really know what consciousness is, but we roughly know some things that are conscious and some things that are not. And basically what's kind of the most obvious things that, is in one but not in the other, right? And this is about as much as we can get people to agree. But nonetheless, I find it a very kind of intuitive definition, right? It really brings us back to why is it that we're studying this thing. So if you actually try to take this a bit more seriously, then you start thinking about theories of consciousness. And there's quite a number of them. If you're interested in the topic, I would thoroughly recommend this recent article by colleagues Anil Seth and Tim Bain. It's a truly fantastic article that goes through quite a number of theories of consciousness. Now, those 4 are kind of particularly highlighted. I'm not going to go into great detail in most of them, but, so the names rings a bell. So we have theories like high order thought, or global workspace, or integrated information, or neuronal reentry, right? So there's a whole, range of theories that all have kind of sometimes slightly and sometimes radically different views of what consciousness is and, what it has to do with the brain. But kind of before we even get to actually thinking or making a theory, the first thing we need to ask, again, as scientists, is when we're going to make a theory, what should that theory even explain? Like, what is it that we're actually explaining? I mean, of course, it's, fantastic and amazing to have this, long-term vision and grandiose questions, but we actually need to kind of also sit down and do some science, right? So what should we actually explain with these theories? And there's a huge number of things you can explain in consciousness science. I'm going to focus on 2 for this talk in particular, but again, there'll be many, many more. So one thing that I'm very interested in explaining is disorders of consciousness, right? And disorders of consciousness is basically, well, the lack of it, right? So normally by disorders of consciousness, we refer to pathological and often permanent loss of consciousness, right? I'm talking about coma, what used to be called the vegetative state, now suitably reworded as unresponsive wakefulness syndrome. This usually results from something like a traumatic brain injury, stroke, or like very severe conditions, right, that cause loss of consciousness, again, often and sadly permanently. And to make things even more difficult, some of the patients that are kind of diagnosed with disorders of consciousness have this thing called covert consciousness. So some people are in this state called a locked-in state, where they may be behaviorally completely unresponsive, completely unable to move at all, and yet there's someone in there, right? Like there's someone at home. And we can see this from like very interesting studies, all the way back from 2006 by Adrian Owen's lab, now up in Canada, right? So why is it that people kind of lose consciousness, and how can we make them kind of get it back, right? So if we kind of taking a bit of an extreme view, for example, if now taking a bit of a diversion, there's a sense, so we have theories of physics are pretty well sorted out, right? If you think of something like general relativity, again, we pretty much know how it goes. There's a sense in which we know physics is true because we went to the moon, right? Like there was no way we could have gotten to the moon if physics as we knew it hadn't been true. So in a way, going to the moon proves that we know physics. Solving disorders of consciousness will prove that we actually know consciousness science, right? This is the going to the moon for us consciousness scientists. And now switching gears, another completely different thing you could try to explain with consciousness is with these theories of consciousness are altered states of consciousness. And altered states are defined, again, so it's hard to define what consciousness is. What does altered consciousness even mean? I'm not going to give a proper definition, but you can basically say that it's some state that is, defined with respect to a normal state of consciousness, and it's broadly a complex, multifaceted change in experience, right? And there's a wide number of ways to induce these altered states of consciousness. They can be pharmacological or non-pharmacological in nature. This is not a to-do list. So there's a whole range of things you can, experimentally induce altered states of consciousness, right? And as a scientist, when I was, as a kind of former physicist, I did my undergrad in physics, and then I kind of slowly got into neuroscience. And I want to share with you these incredible results from now a fairly old paper by Vollenweider and Cometer back in 2010. And what Vollenweider and Commenter did is they kind of compiled data from several studies with two psychedelic substances, or two altered states of consciousness. One of them was psilocybin, and the other one was ketamine. And they basically extracted some sort of subjective reports, right? Like how people are feeling, what's their experience like during these experiences. And when I looked at this plot, I was completely blown away. Why? Because there's structure, right? The fact that there's a pattern, and that pattern is unique to each substance, and it changes according to the dosage, and it's different from the pattern from those other substances. That, as a physicist, that tells me there's structure, there's science to be made. And this plot is a really, really clear indication that, we can make a science of altered states of consciousness. So what should the science of altered states of consciousness do? Well, I would say that very, very broadly, what it needs to do is build a map between physiology and phenomenology. So build a map between the brain and the mind. And there's a whole methodology how to go about this. So we can, grab a group of subjects, then induce some of these altered states, and then study them in a multifaceted, interdisciplinary way. Right? That could involve, neuroimaging data. It could involve subjective assessments. It could involve, interviews where we learn about people's lived experience. And all of these can be combined to learn more about, what is the link between the mind and the brain. So all of that kind of sets a stage for this kind of field of, scientific study of consciousness and theories of consciousness more generally. So what I'm going to do for the rest of this talk is I'm going to structure the talk in 3 parts. The first 2 are going to be about 2 specific theories of consciousness. We're going to go a little bit through them, and then we're going to kind of see what they have to say. First, I'm going to talk about a very simple yet very powerful theory called the entropic brain. Then I'm going to talk about another theory that is not so simple yet also pretty powerful, called integrated information theory. And then I'm going to start speculating pretty wildly. So let's see how far we get there. Again, remember the horse, right? So let's see how far we go. Good. Let's start with the entropic brain. Some of you may have heard about the entropic brain before, but in case someone hasn't, I'm going to kind of say a few words about it anyway. So the entropic brain theory, or the entropic brain hypothesis, is basically a kind of pseudo proto-theory of consciousness that came out kind of in full form in 2014 by Robin Carhart-Harris and collaborators. And the basic premise of the entropic brain is truly quite simple. It basically says that if you have lots of stuff going on in your mind, lots of experiences, lots of content in your consciousness, lots of kind of things going on experientially, then you must also have lots of things going on in your brain, right? Like your brain activity must also have lots of other things going on. So the core premise, or one of the core premises of the entropic brain hypothesis, is that basically a richness of experience in your mind must translate to a very diverse set of signals in your brain. Right? Again, very, very simple. Right? And we're not saying what those signals or what those patterns should be. All we're saying is that if there's lots of different things going on in your mind, there should also be lots of other different things going on in your brain. And again, this was formalized in this 2014 paper. The theory has evolved quite substantially since then. But this remains like a truly fantastic and seminal paper in the field. So I would encourage you all to kind of go and have a look if you're interested. So the key question is, well, how do we quantify this kind of signal diversity or this richness of patterns or anything? The way we do that is through, as the name says, through the quantity of entropy. And entropy is a sort of mathematical object. There's a kind of thing you can measure in data. And there's basically 2 ways of thinking about it. One way of thinking about entropy is sort of as how much information a system contains, very broadly understood. And another way of thinking about entropy is to see how predictable a system is, right? Of course, we can get very, very precise with those. I'm not going to, but those are kind of 2 intuitive ways of thinking about entropy. Entropy was proposed back in 1948. Well, it has a very long history in physics, but in this particular context, it was proposed in 1948 by engineer Claude Shannon, who people normally see in very serious photos, like, you know, sitting next to a computer. He was also really good at unicycling and juggling on a unicycle, and also maths, apparently. So what does entropy actually look like? So one of the standard ways of kind of getting to grips with entropy is, for example, imagine that I'm just flipping a coin over and over, and that coin may or may not be kind of bent, so it comes out one way more than the other, right? So what kind of the usual way we think about this is, let's say that, you know, we put in this kind of axis, in the x-axis, it's the probability that the coin comes up tails when I flip it. So if if the coin is fair, it will be right at the middle. But if the coin is completely bent and it always comes up one way or the other, then it will be either always tails or always heads. And you can see that entropy kind of has a peak right at the middle. I don't know if this works. So entropy has a peak right at the middle, right? Where things, it's really unpredictable. You can't tell what the coin is actually going to do. Now, more practically, how does one go about calculating entropy in brain data? All right, I'm not going to bore you with the details, but kind of very quickly, just to convince you that we're actually doing some science. The way it typically works is, well, you call up your friend who does not work on a computer science department and has some data. So you get the data that comes from a brain normally. Then you save that data to a file. You quite literally compress it, like zip it. And then you do some math and you get some entropy, right? And as you might imagine, that little arrow on the right is doing a lot of heavy lifting. But nonetheless, that's basically the gist, right? So the most popular way of measuring entropy in the brain is this thing called Lempel-Ziff complexity, which is literally the same algorithm that runs when you zip or unzip something in your computer, right? So literally, I find it quite remarkable. Rather, you can learn a lot about consciousness by literally grabbing some data from our brain and zipping it and unzipping it in very, calculated ways. It is quite insane if you think about it. So what are we going to do? So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to kind of be carrying over this kind of little consciousness spectrum, right? And we're going to start populating based on kind of this entropic brain idea and a few other things. We're going to start populating this consciousness spectrum. So on the y-axis, I'm showing entropy. And on the x-axis, I am showing somehow a kind of representation of the state of consciousness. And that will hopefully become clear as we go along. And in this plane, first of all, let's try to orient ourselves. So that point right in the middle, that is you right now. Okay, so you are awake, maybe. You're kind of awake and alert, and you have conscious experience, and kind of that is where you are in the middle, right? And I'm going to draw that line so you keep track of where kind of normal, healthy, wakeful consciousness is. So what do we find if we actually go down to the lab and measure people and kind of compute their entropy? What we find is that entropy consistently decreases when consciousness is lost. We have plenty of evidence to actually justify this claim. So we know from sleep, entropy goes down as you fall deeper and deeper into sleep. It goes slightly up when you're dreaming or in REM sleep. It also goes down if you get put under propofol or some other kinds of anesthesia. It also goes down for people that are in a coma or have some other disorder of consciousness, right? So it doesn't really matter how you lose consciousness. The end result is that your entropy goes down, right? So this supposes very, very strong link between, lower entropy and loss of consciousness. We actually also see this in animals. So for example, here's a study that we published last year on cats. They were falling asleep, and the entropy of the cat brain also goes down, and it goes up when it wakes up, right? So this seems to also generalize across different species. This is not a new idea. This is the oldest paper I've been able to find actually on entropy and consciousness. It's all the way back from 2001, where they had beautiful data visualization practices. And then as another note, and maybe this is something that is kind of not all of you might know before, you can investigate this thing called drowsiness, which is a sort of in-between state of following asleep. So my colleagues in my previous lab in Cambridge had this tremendously cruel experiments where they would grab someone, bring them in the lab at about 7 or 8 p.m., and they would have them do some really boring button pressing task with a EEG cap on, and they would do that for about 1 hour with the lights off, laying back. at 8 or 9 p.m. at night, right? And then, of course, as people were drifting off and kind of slowly getting asleep, then some PhD student would come and shake them and go, hey, wake up, you need to continue doing the task. And that way they would keep people on that kind of in-between state, kind of in between wakefulness and sleep, and study what happens in their brain, right? So we got that data. So we got this data from this large kind of consortium called CAMCON with data from 700 subjects. And what happens is that, well, lo and behold, people get more and more drowsy as they kind of sit, in the scanner, right? So at first it's not very many, and then the fraction of kind of participants that remain awake kind of goes slowly down with time. And you then go and look at their entropy, and the entropy goes down. Not as much, but it goes a little bit down. So this kind of change between kind of high entropy, high consciousness, and low entropy, low consciousness is not discrete, but it's gradual. You lose entropy as you lose consciousness slowly and steadily. And I'm showing here a few other measures that are not super relevant. In case you're interested, I'm happy to kind of point you to the relevant paper. So now we can start filling in some parts of our consciousness spectrum, right? So this kind of dashed vertical line that you may or may not be able to see from the back, that's where you are. And as you lose consciousness, you also start losing entropy, right? So that is you sleeping, for example. And this is hopefully not you right now. So I'm hoping that you're still awake and alert, okay? So now, what happens on the other side? What happens when you give people psychedelics and you poke them with a stick? Right? No, not literal stick, like a mind stick. What happens is that psychedelics dramatically increase brain entropy, right? So this was first reported by colleagues from the University of Sussex down in Brighton in 2017. So entropy goes up quite radically when you take psychedelics. These plots have since been shown to be an underestimate. It increases even more than this, people thought. And we had some follow-up studies where we actually show that this relationship between psychedelics and entropy is heavily modulated by settings. So it's heavily modulated by where you are and what you're doing and kind of what you're paying attention to. So there's a really rich kind of set of ideas we can explore around exactly how psychedelics increase our level of entropy. There's a bunch of ways of explaining this idea. So one kind of evolution of this entropic brain ideas is this other theory called rebus. And rebus stands for relaxed beliefs under psychedelics, right? And I'm not going to go into great detail, but kind of the gist of this rebus business is that kind of we believe that the brain is in some senses a sort of prediction machine, right? So your brain is always trying to predict what's happening next. And you have this interplay between these two signals. So one hand, you have kind of the predictions of what your brain thinks is going to happen. And then you have this thing called prediction errors of what the world is actually doing, which does not always conform to our expectations. Of course, to some people's kind of great disappointment. And the idea is that if you have this kind of type of prediction machine that's going on inside your brain, then what psychedelics do is basically make those predictions a bit more relaxed. So basically, they kind of relax the influence of your internal expectations, the expectations that your brain has about, how reality looks like and what's going to happen. That gets a little bit relaxed, and it becomes of a less strong influence on your brain's dynamics. And that, in turn, there's some really good theoretical arguments as to why that actually increases, the entropy in your neural activity. So we have a kind of deeper theoretical framework to explain why psychedelics increase our entropy. So now we can sort of fill in the other half of the spectrum, and we can go, well, maybe that's you on LSD with a high level of entropy. Right. Based on that, on this reasoning, you would expect that, well, maybe psychedelics are some sort of higher states of consciousness, right? Because you've increased the entropy. Well, surely if you decrease when you lose consciousness, then if you increase, then you must have more consciousness, right? And that's sort of what the press actually picked this up and ran with it, right? So you have articles from Wired saying brain scans reveal how psychedelic drugs create a higher state of consciousness. Reputable venues like The Guardian saying that psychedelic drugs induced heightened state of consciousness. Vice, digs in and says psychedelic drugs really do lead to a higher state of consciousness. Right? So people really ran with it. And I'm really going to question this, right? This is what I'm going to kind of do the rest of the talk. Before I do, though, I do want to say that people at the time were really surprised because we never expected, until then, we never expected a situation where our entropy would go up, right? Again, all of the known evidence until then was of entropy going down. So, finding a case where entropy was going up was really quite unexpected. And since then, we found another one, and that is musical improvisation. And this has nothing to do with psychedelics, but I hope that you'll actually find it interesting. So I would argue that musical improvisation is kind of, by every account, an altered state of consciousness. And the way I'm going to try to show that is by reading for you this quote by Julio Cortázar from a book called, in Spanish, El Perseguidor, The Pursuer. That's a book about Charlie Parker, effectively. So let me read this for you. This is a quote about the musician Charlie Parker, amazing saxophonist, telling about his experience, his lived experience while playing. And he said, "Hell no, I don't get lost when I'm playing. Only the place changes. It's like in an elevator. You're in an elevator talking with people. You don't feel anything strange. Meanwhile, you've passed the first floor, the 10th, the 21st, and the city is down there below you. And you're finishing the sentence you began when you stepped into it. And between the first words and the last ones, there are 52 floors. I realized that when I started playing, I was stepping into an elevator, but the elevator was time, if I can put it that way." If that's not an altered state of consciousness, you tell me. Right? So it's this incredible other, again, fully non-pharmacological way of getting ourselves into this altered state of consciousness. So what we did, we actually tested this. So we have this amazing collaboration with, so the guy you see in the back is Professor David Dolan from the Guildhall School of Music and Drama in London. And we organized this concert where we got this incredible trio of musicians and some very unlucky concert goers that suddenly got put a very sticky EEG on their heads. And we measured them while they played some pieces of music in two modes: strict, so non-improvised, and let go, where they would actually kind of, let go and improvise. What do we see? We see that actually improvising increases brain entropy, right? This was also, to my knowledge, the first report of a non-pharmacological increase in entropy. So going back to our consciousness spectrum, if that's you and LSD, then somewhere in between is you doing improv, right? So now we're starting to fill up this spectrum a little bit. So now that we've covered the entropic brain, let me kind of take another, switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to tell you about this other theory called integrated information theory. So again, I'm switching gears a little bit. We've covered what the entropic brain hypothesis has to say about consciousness and about psychedelics. Now I'm going to change to another perspective. That is this perspective of another theory called integrated information theory. An integrated information theory, or IIT for short, was coined as the brainchild of a neuroscientist called Giulio Tononi. And IIT basically, again, I'm going to use lots of fancy words here. It identifies consciousness with properties of cause-effect structures. Let me actually kind of elaborate a bit more on what it is this means, or what this implies. So what ID does, it basically starts with some phenomenological axiom, so with some properties that we believe subjective experience has, and those are properties like intrinsic existence and composition and information and so on and so forth. So it tries to write that down in math to the best of our ability, and then there's a big kind of math sausage machine that you turn, and out the other side comes this other thing called phi, which is some measure of integrated information, right? And the core idea of IIT is that a system is conscious if the causal connections between them are sort of integrated as a whole, right? So if you cannot reduce a brain, for example, to just two half brains put together, right? Now, in the consciousness science community, IIT is sort of infamously difficult. I don't know why anyone would think that. It's very, very easy to calculate this phi thing. You only need to do this, and also this, and also this, and also this. And this is an actual figure from their latest paper. It spans 2 pages of very weird boxes with math. I'm not going to cover that. Okay. So there's this huge apparatus and kind of in IIT and what you're meant to do and all that, stuff you can do with it. A few friends of mine and I, we didn't quite like it. So what we did was we took an approach basically by the ethos of divide and conquer. All right, so we got this huge apparatus of IIT and we sort of split it into two. And we called it strong IIT and weak IIT. And kind of that allows you philosophically to distinguish between one branch, which is strong IIT, the goal of which is to find some fundamental universal identity between these funky causal structures and conscious experience. So it's sort of the purest mathematical, philosophical quest to formulate a theory of consciousness. If it takes us, a few hundred pages of math, it doesn't matter. If you can't possibly calculate it on a living brain, it doesn't matter either, as long as we're kind of mathematically convinced enough. So that's one thing you can do. What I like to do is this other thing called weak IIT, which is much more based on experiments, right? Because again, sticks, right? So what we do in weak IIT is to find empirically useful measures that allows us to predict, explain, and control aspects of consciousness, right? So we can eventually go and wake up the people that are sadly in a disorder or that have a disorder of consciousness. And kind of the rationale of weak IIT is, hopefully a bit simpler. So basically, if you have a system like the brain, you split it in half and you see how much information is lost. Right? So if you have a system that's like that, so imagine that, time goes from left to right. You have the kind of system with all the connections that are up in the left, and then you cut it down the middle, and you compare the two and see how much information you've lost. And that is somewhat, to a degree, kind of similar to when you have a heartbreak, and also something is lost. Except having a heartbreak, you split the brain in two, and you see what you can do. Right? So this is sort of the very, very just, very intuitive idea behind this weak IIT. And doing this, we formulated two kind of weak measures of integrated information that I'm only going to name because I'm going to look at them later, but they're basically two measures that are very similar to each other and capture this idea of how much do you lose if you split the brain in half, so to speak. One of them was a revised phi measure that we inevitably had to call fire. And then there's a few other measures, that go under the mathematical theory of synergy. So now I'm going to say a few words about fire and synergy and see what we can learn about consciousness from them. So first of all, we investigated loss of consciousness. And the question is, well, does a loss of consciousness imply a loss of synergy? And the answer is yes, otherwise I probably wouldn't be here. So synergy does predict disorders of consciousness, right? When you kind of look at people that have patients that have a disorder of consciousness, the synergy in their brain is much, much lower than that of healthy controls. And we've seen this in empirical fMRI data. We've also been able to make computational models that reproduce kind of the relevant aspects of, brain activity. Then you could also argue, well, but that's only for disorders of consciousness, right? What happened to that story of looking at different data sets and different ways of inducing loss of consciousness? So we tried that too, right? And what we looked at was we compared this revised phi, or with this fire measure across different data sets, one with subjects in coma and another one with people, that have kind of a temporary loss of consciousness due to anesthesia. And lo and behold, we also see a reduction in the fire with loss of consciousness. And not only that, but all the reductions in this kind of revised integrated information measure were happening in the default mode network, which is a part of the brain you may have heard of. It's fun. So it basically, we saw reductions in this sort of medial line throughout the brain. I'm not sure if you can see it very well from the back, but we observe reductions in fire that happen in precisely the right place of the brain we would expect it to. So success. Now we can also continue populating our spectrum, right? And we have the entropy line up in blue, and we also see that kind of if you add to this plot the integrated information, if you start from the normal state, as you lose consciousness, you also lose integrated information. So that's all good. So that could be, for example, you under anesthesia. But so far, what we've so now for the last kind of 10 or so minutes of the talk, what I'm going to do is speculate what's going on here? Right, so what's going on in that kind of the same place where we had psychedelics before? What would happen to integrated information? So I'm going to speculate now a little bit about psychedelics and IIT and how they related and what do we learn from one, about one with the other. So the key question, and I don't think has been nearly well enough studied in the literature, is what happens to integrate information and the psychedelics? So I can basically, there's roughly two ideas, right? So I'm going to, again, go to the same spectrum. So on the left, we have loss of consciousness. On the right, we have psychedelics, right? And I'm showing both entropy in blue and integrated information in red. So one thing that could happen is that psychedelics also increase integrated information, or they could decrease it, right? Those are the two kind of competing hypotheses that we can formulate. If the thing in the left is true, then we could actually say that there's considerable consistent support that psychedelics create a higher state of consciousness. Again, because you have several theories, and they all kind of agree that in whichever way you define consciousness, psychedelics give you more of it. So, people in the Guardian can rest, right? So that would be one thing. If, however, the thing on the right is true, now we're in much more interesting territory, right? Because then psychedelics are just, give you a completely different state altogether, right? So you have two seemingly similar definitions or quantifications of consciousness that seem to agree on half of the cases and vastly disagree on the other half. And this is kind of where things get really interesting. Does anyone have any hypotheses on where this is going to go? So I would vote for this one. I'm going to try to convince you in the last 7 minutes of the talk is that actually, we can expect and we do observe a loss of integrated information when people are under the influence of psychedelics. And I'm going to first give you two intuitive arguments for why that might be the case. I'm not going to delve too deeply on this, but one of them is about the relationship between synergy and the self. So in a way, this concept of synergy, or this kind of concept of integrated information, is sort of a way in which the whole is more than the sum of the parts, right? So it is something that is kind of beyond the specifics of, it's some process in your brain that doesn't depend on anything, any specific kind of aspect of any single brain region. It's sort of global emergent phenomenon, so to speak. And we kind of wrote this philosophy paper a while back where we, well, not that long ago, where we actually postulated that this idea of this kind of emergent property, this kind of emergent synergy, was actually a whole, pretty similar to our sense of self, right? What is the self? The self is that thing that remains when all the little pieces change. And if you think about it for long enough, well, we came to the conclusion that the self had a lot to do with synergy, in particular with a very special type of synergy called causal decoupling. I'm not going to go to that, but some notion of synergy, right? And we wrote this in this philosophy paper published a couple of years ago on, what is it like to be a bit? So in synergy, in consciousness, there's this running aphorism of what is it like to be a bat? Like, what is the subjective experience of a bat? And we were approaching this from an entropy and information theory point of view. So the pun was just waiting to be made. And we called the paper What It's Like to Be a Bit. You can read more about this. There's a sort of philosophical argument for why we would expect a the self, the sense of self, to be tightly connected to the synergy between different parts of our brain. Then we also made another argument more recently. Now this should be hopefully being written up for publication soon, based on this idea of predictive processing. And it's getting a bit late, and I don't want to give you too many details, but for those of you that are maybe a bit more technically informed, what we did is we simulated several neural populations, minimizing their prediction errors jointly while solving a task. So again, remember this interplay we had previously between predictions going one side and prediction errors going the other way. We did this, but with multiple different neural populations. And what we saw is that integrated information emerges quite naturally from the collective efforts of different parts of the brain trying to play this game together, right? So in a way, this predictive processing idea also explains why we observe the integrated information that we do. So in that regard, if under this kind of rebus ideas, if you have more relaxed kind of predictive processing going on, then you may also have a less of a integrated information. Again, don't want to go too much into detail, but we have some kind of hypotheses for why that might be the case. And then what we did was naturally, again, we went and into the lab and tested it. So we grabbed source localized. So we have MEG data from basically the magnetic activity of the brain. We localized it to see where in the brain those magnetic signals were coming from. And we looked at subjects who were either under the effect of a placebo, so normal waking consciousness, or under the effect of LSD. And overall, we see a big decrease in synergy, basically all across the brain for almost every subject, extremely significant, p below 0.05, thus it is true, right? So this is what we observe in the experiment. And not only that, but if you look a bit more closely, we looked at the synergy specifically in the default mode network, an part of the brain that is normally taken to be involved in self-related processing. And boom, the decreases in synergy in the default mode network actually predicted to what extent people's had feelings of ego dissolution. So the more someone felt subjectively the experience of ego dissolution, the more the synergy in the default mode network collapsed. So we have specific evidence, and not only there's a kind of absolute change, but the change correlates with exactly the one thing we would expect it to. So this was nice. And then we also managed to actually reproduce this in a computational model, right? So we put all of these ideas of predictive processing and rebus and all of that stuff. We made the model, and then we turned the crank, and what we saw is that the kind of plot in the middle basically represents entropy, goes up, and the plot in the right represents some notion of communication between neurons, and that goes down, right? So we managed to get all of these ideas also into a computational model that reproduced our findings. So what have we learned with all of this? Now we can fill the spectrum of consciousness, right? And now we can see that while kind of entropy does sort of increase monotonically from all the way from loss of consciousness, anesthesia, sleep, drowsiness, and then up to musical improvisation and psychedelics, integrated information does a much more interesting shape, and it has this kind of differing profile. So now I would sort of go back to the people that wrote those press articles, and I would say that we have fairly convincing evidence now that the psychedelic state isn't simply a higher state of consciousness, right? It's not simply that every definition of consciousness agrees that it's higher on the psychedelics and that's it. I would say this is a lot more exciting, right? Because this kind of really shows that psychedelics are, the psychedelic state is a truly unique state that challenges current theories of consciousness in multiple ways. And with that, I'm going to open up for questions. So if you're interested, feel free to drop by my website and read some of these papers. I'll be hanging around and going to the pub, so feel free to ask any questions. So long, and thanks for all the advice.
Excellent talk.